Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. Today, we'll be breaking down one of the best games from the top players in the world. Today, we're taking a look at a game played in 2017 where Magnus Carlsen had the white pieces and played against Wesley with the black pieces. The thing that makes this game so interesting is the fact that Magnus Carlsen started with a much less common opening known as the bird's opening, f4. And if you do not know the bird's opening, I would recommend watching a video that's going to pop up right now on this side of the screen. That's going to take you to the video that's about the bird's opening that I created. I think it might be a little bit helpful for today's video. After you finish watching that, make sure you guys pop back in and let's get it right on with the game. So like I said, this game started with the bird's opening, and Wesley actually took a little spin of his own in the bird's opening, and instead of playing the two most common moves, which is either knight to f6 or just d5, Wesley decided to play this move here. And it maybe looks a little strange, but I actually really like it. I think that it takes the game a little bit off book and keeps the game a little more exciting. And even though Wesley played different moves, Magnus Carlsen just continued with the normal move order that you'd see typically. The only difference really is instead of pushing this pawn up 1 is pushing it up 2, taking advantage of the fact that there's nothing stopping the pawn from having a good time at this location. If the knight was here, then obviously the knight would be an issue of going here. If the pawn was here, obviously the pawn would be an issue of going here. But taking advantage of the fact that there's nothing stopping this, I quite like that move. And now Wesley played this move here, and I really enjoyed it because it serves two purposes. The most maybe obvious purpose is obviously just giving a more secure path for this pawn to be pushed ahead next game, right? Now it's going to be supported a little bit more by both pieces. But also, it allows the knight to, instead of coming to this location, come to this location. And the benefit with this is that it keeps the knight able to switch from side to side throughout the game. And it really depends which way white castles. You can see that white decides to castle queen side later on. And in the bird's opening, you really don't know. Usually you tend to castle king side, but even then you don't know where you want to castle yet. So I like this move, having the knight kind of on standby, ready to go to either side. Again, and just Magnus Carlsen continued normal ideas. Usually I prefer to first take out the bishop, but it's just a different move order for the same thing. And surprisingly, okay, so as you can see, this breakthrough of pushing the pawns here, and Magnus Carlsen decides to just support the pawn, which I quite like. And after take, have another, or keep the free path for the bishop. And actually, usually you would have already developed your bishop, but considering the fact that Magnus Carlsen in his head wanted to castle queenside, I think it's acceptable how late Magnus Carlsen developed his bishop. Usually you develop your bishop. Remember when Magnus Carlsen played this move? That's a sign that you want to develop your bishop early, and that's the most common move, developing your bishop after pushing this pawn up. But Magnus Carlsen decided to wait a little bit, and I quite like that. It's not signifying that what, I'm going to castle this side, and it's just taking some time. And here we have a trade of queens. Luckily, the knight can hop back, which is one advantage of having the knight on these spots. They can hop back to support, and obviously now white can still castle. Here you see this move here, and this is a sign that now it's a better position for white to play the bishop to this spot here, because if black were to play this move, it would slightly worsen black's structure of pawns, and so it would have been a little bit easier to play that move, which is exactly what happens very soon. You can see that first Magnus decides to castle, and again queenside castling. And the only disadvantage really with the queenside castle is that it leaves the king a little bit more open. And you can see what Magnus Carlsen does in a couple of moves to support the king a little bit more and have a little bit more of a safe king. Because the reason right now the problem is that there's two diagonals, not from there, from here, two diagonals that are eyeing down the king. And that could be very dangerous, especially when both bishops are on the board for your opponent. This could lead to something a little dangerous. So after this, and you can see that the knight went back and back, which is a wonderful move, relocating the knight again. I think that a lot of times people play the knight to a position and just stick it there. So, but you can relocate the knight a couple of times even, and get it to where it needs to be. Here, obviously, it's trying to eye down this location here. And if you move here, where Magnus Carlsen takes the trade, now there would be an open file for Wesley So, which could serve a very nice purpose later on in the game, which is where Wesley So wants to move the knight. And here, you see the development of the bishop, finally. Again, much later than you usually typically see with the bird's opening, but I quite like this. Now, this would weaken the structure. However, that's exactly what Wesley So does. And it's not the worst move at all. Actually, it's a good move. Everything is supported. It's just it's taking away this pawn chain, but it's not the end of the world. And here, Magnus Carlsen backs the bishop out, which was his plan all along. He wanted to go here, make Wesley So push his pawn up, and then push the bishop here, and actually relocate it to another position, which is what you can see happens very soon in the game. Right now, Wesley So pushes this pawn again, and I like this move, now trying to maybe re-get that structure of pawns. And here, nice in-between move, capture the knight. But now, Magnus Carlsen goes ahead and brings the bishop down there, and this supports the king. Now you have both bishops on that diagonal that we were talking about. Oh, not that, those diagonals. So it's going to be a little bit harder for white to form an attack, which is obviously a great position. And like I said, obviously trying to bring the knight to this nice outpost where it attacks two pieces. And here you do go for a trade and freeing this nice file for Wesley So's rook. And now obviously Wesley So didn't castle yet, consider that. So that it's fairly interesting. You still don't know if he's going to castle. It's becoming more middle game. But if he will castle, I highly doubt that it will be to this location now, because there's a huge disadvantage with going there. One being the semi-open h-file, the other one being just two very, very good bishops eyeing down that location. So if Wesley So decides to castle, I would highly recommend castling this side. And whenever you want to castle and both options are there for you, take a minute to think what would benefit you the most. Hoping to maybe double up on this file, which is exactly what Wesley So allows him to do. And after capture, just simplifying the game a little bit. And now from this position, well, actually from playing this move, you can tell that Wesley So is not going to castle this game. It's just not worth it for him, and obviously this move now prohibits him from castling, but it wasn't worth it for him. And you don't always have to castle. I mean, when you think about king safety, this king is very safe. It has two bishops supporting it, and it has a couple of escape paths, especially with this rook coming to aid it. So, very safe king. And here you just see some pawn pushes and, trying to maybe waste some moves. This game is very still. There's nothing really to do for both players. And here attacking this pawn here, pushing the bishop, protecting it. And here you see another trade of bishops. This could be very dangerous in the sense that now you have a passed pawn that's so close to promoting. But realistically, you can easily shut that off by moving the rook here. And there's no way to stop this. So here, you can see this is a nice structure of pawns. The only problem with it is that right now it's a little overreached, in the sense that this bishop supports this pawn and this pawn supports this pawn, but this pawn is only supported by one pawn. So this push here could be a little deadly, which is why after here, Magnus Carlsen decides to definitely capture this pawn here, and stick to a nice structure that's a little bit less, it's a little smaller. Notice that Magnus Carlsen cannot capture this pawn here because this rook is supporting this pawn here. which is why Magnus Carlsen wants to start pushing this pawn up and take this, or I guess unpin the rook from the pawn. Like I said, pushing the pawn up, and now Magnus Carlsen can indeed capture this pawn up here. And in this endgame, the position it looks very drawish, but one player blunders quite severely, and we'll get on with that very soon. You can see that here the kings are trying to get into the board, which is one advantage of having the king in the center rather than in the side where you have to, push it a little bit more. And what a great move by Magnus Carlsen. Absolutely beautiful move. Offering up this pawn for a trap. Okay, so when you move the bishop here, which is what Wesley So just did, it looks all right. You're targeting a few things, but you have to make sure that this bishop is supported. Otherwise, this bishop, although it is targeting things, it can be a target, especially when one of the things it's targeting can capture it, which is exactly what Magnus Carlsen takes advantage of, this unsupported bishop. So you can see he traps the king. The king wasn't forced to capture, but if the king moved here, for example, then you can just continue pushing pawns, and the king would just have to continue walking up the board. So when Magnus Carlsen offered up this pawn, Wesley So accepted it, and now you see this check here, discovering this bishop here. But before Magnus Carlsen captures the bishop, he goes here and checks the opponent again, and then captures the bishop. And actually, material-wise, especially after the king captures this piece here, material-wise is very, very even. But late game, you definitely prefer a bishop and a rook for a rook and a couple more pieces, a couple more pawns. Especially when the bishop, it can easily just stop here, and there's nothing that this pawn can do. The pawn cannot do anything against it. So here in this position, Wesley So decided to resign the game, and rightfully so. There's the game would have just continued with the to one of these spots, and then you can just continue pushing and harassing the king, and it wouldn't have ended very good for Wesley So. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys did, make sure you guys check out my other videos, and I'll see you next time.